All right. I think we're getting closer to 1:02, so let's get started. So thank you all for joining us today. So this is a joint session between our usual Voice of PSC and the APS users meeting. I'm very excited to receive Dr. Lou Strolger, who's the deputy head of the instrument division at Space Telescope Science and a researcher scientist at Physics and Astronomy at Johns Hopkins. Lou, I think I hand it over to you. We are very excited to have you today, and you can get started.
Thank you, Fanny. I appreciate it. Can you all hear me okay? Just want to check the audio real quick.
Yes.
I see some nodding heads. That's awesome. So today I was asked to talk a little bit about our dual anonymous proposal review and how it came into effect at Space Telescope. And I will start by presenting this first. I'd like to start off with a quote. And this probably is a very good testimonial to why the dual anonymous peer review works and how it's been working in different arenas. The NASA Astrophysics Science Mission Directorate has adopted a dual anonymous review for pretty much all of their peer-reviewed processes of some type or another. But they did a trial test of this about a year or two ago. And this was the observation made by their associate administrator for research at the time, that at that time, about 26% of the applicant pool for the ADAP program, couldn't read my own slide there. It's kind of hidden. There we go. Were women, but only 16% of the time did they fall in the top two rankings of the recommended proposals. This would essentially guarantee funding. But after their switch to dual anonymous, the female PIs constitute about 31% of their pool, and finished in the top two places 32% of the time. That was a huge increase in the likelihood of female PIs to receive awards, and indeed did receive awards for that program that year. And it has continued to been a real wow for this program since then. So my outline is pretty straightforward. I'll talk a little bit about the state of diversity in the US. I'll talk about our program and how we how we came to adopt the dual anonymous review. I'll share the results and how this has been taken on at different places. And I will give some clues as to what's next, both with our program and what I hope will happen through the rest of the astronomy and physics communities together. So several of you are probably familiar with this sort of slide, right? We understand that as of the 2020 census, actually, the status is that half of the US population, a little bit more than half, are women. 40% of the US population belong to some racial or ethnic minority, and 34% of the population belong to what we would call an underrepresented minority in STEM. This would include African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans and some Pacific Islanders. It does not include Asian Americans for the large part. When you look at a tract of the percentage of physics degrees, which has sort of been our litmus for how well we think we're doing in attracting women and underrepresented minorities to our field, we are struck by two things. One, that their percentage of the field, the percentage of degrees which are awarded both at baccalaureate degrees and at PhDs, is woefully low in comparison to their percentage of the population. It doesn't appear that we're reaching any sort of parity with their participation. But I think what is most striking is that fraction of awards that are, or fraction of of degrees that go to women and underrepresented minorities hasn't increased over the 25 years plus that I've been tracking this, that we in the community have been tracking this, I should say. Over my career, despite all of the progressive actions that I think astronomy and physics has tried to take to try and attract and retain both minorities and women in our field, there hasn't really been much of a change, much of a movement in the needle, except for maybe a 0.5% increase in PhDs awarded to women over that 25-year period. When I concentrate on my own field of astronomy, we again think of ourselves as being rather progressive when it comes to the fraction of women who participate in our field and the fraction of minorities who participate in our field. But we are always surprised, I think, when we see our traction in comparison to other fields and realize that we are not as progressive as we think we are. In fact, we're woefully behind. Biology and chemistry certainly lead the pack. And in some cases, mathematics does even better than astronomy. So what I hope to do today, of course, is to make that case as to why diversity matters. And you can take several different views on this. One of the more common one is to think of it as if we think that astronomy and physics are meritorious fields, where the most scientific meritorious ideas rise to the top, then we are really talking about making sure that we have more stimulus in the pool, larger talent pools, to ensure that we don't have any talent losses and make sure that we have the most meritorious outcomes. That's one way you can think of it. Another more popular way I think that people tend to think of this is about the social responsibility, that everyone has a right to an equal share of the education and workforce in the country. And when we talk about equity, we're really are talking about equity. We're not talking about providing an equal playing field as of now, because of course, for many, that playing field is not very equal at all. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving around here. What we're really talking about is an equity situation where those who have the least, advantages get a little bit of an additional advantage so they can equal out the playing field. And of course, we realize that reality is such that the inequality is so vast that it's so hard to provide a more equitable situation. Some of the more interesting ideas behind, the case for diversity come from, folks who study this as in their full time. This is their profession. And one of the more interesting examples I was given was from Scott E. Page. And the idea is basically that people bring diverse points of view to tackling problems. So, for instance, the weight of a cow is an interesting idea. It goes back to an example where at a county fair sometime long ago, a bunch of farmers were asked to visually look at a cow and guess at its weight. And each of these farmers, of course, come to this problem in different ways. They have seen cows from different perspectives. They have a pretty good idea of how their cows may weigh just based on their size. They have other reasons to guess at how they may weigh based on the size of their belly or what have you. And in the end, they all come up with close but rather inaccurate guesses as to what that weight might be. But when you add the collective intellect of this crowd, you end up with an actual value that is actually pretty close to the precise and accurate weight of this cow. And the answer here, of course, is that diverse crowds often make the most accurate predictions. And it's a good idea to try and take advantage of that. I don't know how the cow slide ended up twice, but we'll keep moving on. Hold on. This is something, of course, that businesses have known for a very long time, and it has a lot to do both with the idea that diverse crowds make good decisions, but also having diverse representation in your workforce yields a greater profitability, period. And it may deal more with how how vendors and how customers see that diverse workforce and who they choose to work with. But again, it also may just be the fact that diverse crowds make better decisions. There are other cases for diversity, which I'll just go through rather quickly, but there are gender and race-based innovations for which women and minorities do bring unique perspectives based on their own backgrounds. For instance, in 2002, it was pretty well understood that there was a problem with seatbelt designs in most modern cars, especially when it comes to pregnant women. And that this would result in a relatively high fetus fatality at above rather small speeds. It was understood that, or at least Volvo came up with a really interesting idea of having women design the next set of safety standards for their upcoming release of automobiles. And by doing such, they actually developed a 3-point harness system that was even better than the ones that were available prior to then, and reduced this fetus injury point. They went further and designed a lot of very ergonomic and very interesting designs to the YCC car. This is a car that never actually hit the market, but its designs carried forward to future designs that are used throughout the automotive industry. And it includes things like smart keyless entry, easy access to get in and out of the vehicle, good visibility, and of course, ease to park. In more serious situations, in many parts of the world, there is a dearth of reliable and efficient access to water for many people. This has a lot to do with just the nature of climate change and the nature of politics, but these tend to be in regions where it's very difficult for scientists to engage with the community to understand what the issues are with their access to water and how reliable that water can be. It actually has a direct impact on, or I think a more close to home situation, which is very similar to this, where we had the Flint water crisis not too long ago, and someone could say that it's still continuing. But it was very tough to get a handle on how bad the problem was initially, because it was tough to get into the households of individuals in these low-income houses. Here, breakthroughs came through women and through underrepresented minorities who earned the trust of those communities, to better understand the impact on water quality and on children in the area. We're still beginning to, of course, learn the full impacts of this water crisis. Okay, so I've given you a couple of examples of why I think this is important, but here I think is my chief argument. We now understand that we are reaching a minority-majority nation. Sometime in this decade, children of our nation will be, more than half of the children of our nation will be born to some racial or ethnic minority. And in 20 years or so, that group will hit the nation's workforce, and the majority will be non-white. You add to this a shrinking working age to support some other issues, including retiring baby boomers and Gen Xers of that time. There won't be many baby boomers, but a lot of Gen Xers at that time. And we have an impending workforce problem where if we continue at the rate of undereducating underserved minorities into the future, we will not be prepared to meet the challenges of the near future. So we are going to run into a critical problem that really does, it's an existential crisis that extends beyond the idea of, why should minority students be in physics classes in terms of what unique perspectives they bring to the situation, how they help to improve classes. That's not really the goal. You're looking to address an impending problem that will only get worse if we do not address it early on. More to the fact, we need to understand that it's a separate yet equal situation where we provide opportunities for underrepresented minorities and women in a different setting than we do for majority white or majority Asian students will also create a disparity in preparedness for these for whatever ventures we have coming in the next decades. So what I took I had some a reading list that I took into understanding how we can change our own system at Space Telescope. And one of those, which I borrowed heavily from for these previous slides, was the diversity bonus from Scott Page. And I think that from that perspective, I learned quite a bit about how diversity brings more meritorious outcomes, provides a substantial bonus through these unique perspectives, and answers issues of, how are we going to develop our critical workforce for the next decade and more. Two other books I'll recommend just quickly is The Weapons of Math Destruction. This really addresses what inequitable practices or policies or behaviors you may have by design without really knowing about it, and how to improve or change those practices. And thirdly, The Tyranny of Metrics revolves around how you use time-saving resources and statistical models to try and save time, but often come at the expense of the diversity, also by design. So I encourage you to take a look at these books. They're in a lot of different areas. Amazon is where I found most of these. Okay, so we took a long, hard look at how our process could be improved and what steps we could do to reduce bias. And I'll tell you a little bit about our process. Every year, our allocation of telescope time is done through a peer review process, where in response to each call, which used to be yearly with just the Hubble Space Telescope, and now we have the Hubble and James Webb Space Telescope, both running simultaneously. And in response to each of those calls, we received well over 1,000 proposals from the scientific community, of which only about 20% or so can actually be implemented. We enlist a panel of experts to evaluate these proposals, largely on their scientific merit, technical feasibility, and responsibility of use, or other important aspects. But we really ask them to provide their recommendation of what the most scientifically meritorious proposals are. Our director, then, who is the allocating official, then takes those recommendations and determines what to allocate for the upcoming cycle. In general, we thought we were doing fairly well. When we track how female principal investigators do over time with respect to their male counterparts, the number of proposals that are submitted or led by female PIs is steadily increasing over time and continues to increase in a very positive way, about 0.6% per year, pretty close to the fraction of PhDs who are entering into the field. But where we saw a problem was in the proposal acceptance rate as a function of gender over time. And here I'm looking at 17-year period from what we call our cycle 11 to cycle 25, from 2001 to 2017. The award rates for male PIs are shown relative to female PIs. And what we can see is that there is two important key features. One, of course, is that male PIs seem to outperform female PIs on a regular basis. And that regular basis seems to be persistent in every cycle over a 17-year period, with an average of about a 5% gap, performance gap. I should also point out here that the way in which we determine gender was largely determined from the names of the principal investigators, and through using online utilities to determine gender in a cisgender way. We didn't have the resources to go further to determine any non-cisgender identities, or to poll the proposing to poll the proposers for their gender identity. We thought this was still a very valid exercise, because what we were looking to see if we can capture is how outward appearance bias plays an effect in our field. Of course, this was an easier, I should say, without knowing much of the demographics of our proposing pool, it's hard to do much analysis further than the gender disparity. But we could pretty well be assured that gender disparity was probably the tip of the iceberg. There were probably a lot of other various inequities due to conscious and unconscious identity bias that we didn't have direct access to. So we knew that whatever it is that we were going to have to do, we're going to try and address these larger senses of identity bias, and as well see if we can understand the gender disparity gap. So we sought a lot of we did a lot of discussion, we sought a lot of advice, and we thought about this quite a bit. We hired some consultants to help us decide, to review our process, to help us understand where there may be critical issues of bias. They came back with very clear evidence that in our discussions and in our face-to-face discussions of proposals, our reviewers tended to focus on the identities of the proposers, and have that be a really large component of their analysis of who to recommend. As we start to develop an idea of how we wanted to move forward, we sought buy-in from the STScI directorate, as well as the NASA Astrophysics directorate, to better understand what they would be willing to implement. We have a number of advisory committees that report to the Institute, including our users committee, the STUC, an Institute committee, which we call the STIC, and many other advisory committees. We sought their inputs as well. Based on those discussions, we constituted a working group to propose an idea for how an anonymous proposal review could be implemented in our system. And basically building off of our current proposal process to see how that could actually be effective for the community and for ourselves. We engaged in a dialogue, several actually, with our community to solicit input and identify and mitigate what concerns that we could. And we provided guidelines to the community for how to craft proposals and how to review proposals in an anonymous setting. And I'll come to that a little bit more in just a bit. Our feedback, as I was talking to about the dialogue, that was sought through online forums, through emails, and a few in-person meetings. And just to share a little bit of how that feedback went, and I'd say most of it was sort of 50-50 and following pretty much this review that we did through an online or email solicitation. But we found that most of those who were for an anonymous review tended to have a more recent PhD year on average than those who were against it. There was some indication that those that were for the anonymous review were more female than those who were tended to be against it, or the fraction of those who were for it were more heavily weighted to female than those who were against it. And there was a middling crowd that was somewhere in the middle of both of those statistics. But based on all this input, we decided to recommend a dual anonymous proposal review for both facilities, so that the identity of the proposers are not immediately known to reviewers in the process of determining their scientific ranks. And we decided that the process itself should be relying on the proposers themselves to provide an anonymous proposal. So how's that done? So the proposers craft their submissions with the guidelines to exclude names and affiliations from their submissions. This includes in their references, in their figures, and in their personal websites. Other than that, it was encouraging them not to, basically show their hand. Do not claim ownership of past work, my successful HST program from years past, or analysis shown in Strolger et al. 2012, or anything of that like. Instead, we were encouraging them to cite programs and sort of a passive third-person voice. The HST program, GEO did such and such, or the analysis shown by Strolger et al. In 2012 showed this, and so on. We also encouraged them not to, to include references to proprietary data and software that was, unaccessibly publicly. Okay. We did, however, encourage them to be very proactive, to describe the work in a very positive way, in a very determinate way, like we propose to do the following, or we will measure the effects of. So the idea being that one can still show the excitement and validity of the work that they want to do without having to really bring in their identities to validate or further advocate for their work. To our review committees, we suggested simply that they have to consider proposals based solely on that scientific merit. They are not to try and look for names or affiliations in their proposals, or look for websites, or try to do a deeper dive into who is actually proposing. That in itself, we found was actually quite a bit of a waste of time, because there isn't a whole lot of time to review 1,000 proposals and discuss them in an in-person environment. But to ensure that, we were quite cognizant of the fact that it doesn't take much to insinuate who the authors may be, or to encourage a group to go looking at a website, etc. So we tried to keep the field level by including levelers. These were persons in the room whose sole function is to ensure the discussion focuses on the scientific merit. they are the ones who will interrupt the discussion if it looks like it will veer towards identities or any of the anything that would reveal the team in some way. But because we also think that team expertise and background are important to evaluate before the final awarding of a proposal, we try to separate that from the scientific ranking, the scientific merit evaluation. And we include that information to reviewers at the end of the scientific ranking process. And this is used only to essentially eliminate proposals that people feel or the team lacks the expertise to actually implement. And it's not used as information to re-rank scientific proposals. All right, so how did this fare? As I showed you before, we had this disparity of about 5% between female PIs and their male counterparts. And the first cycle we implemented this, cycle 26, I should first preference this. This was in 2018. We were anticipating a launch of Web at that time, and as such, only solicited for fewer proposals, those of the large nature to HST, to try and mitigate the fact that we'd have to do 2 reviews in a relatively short period of time. That ended up not being the case, but nonetheless, we ended up with fewer awarded proposals in that cycle. So but what we did observe in that one cycle was not only did the gap shrink, but it immediately flipped. We saw that female PIs outperformed their male counterparts for this particular call for proposals. And since then, we've run 4 other calls and reviews, 3 for HST and 1 for James Webb. Of course, the award rate immediately flipped back to being to having a slight advantage to male PIs. But one thing you can certainly see is that the performance gap between female and male PIs has definitely shrunk to less than 1% now. And I should have included, we have cycle 30 data, which I neglected to put on there, and it still remains particularly low, less than 1%. By way of sort of collateral benefits, we knew that by having an anonymous process, we might entice investigators to lead proposals when in the previous format, they may be more inclined to have more senior members of their team lead those programs. What we didn't expect is that it would be such a huge change in the success rate to new proposers. Here we see those new proposers as a fraction of proposals accepted, a percentage of proposals accepted, wherein from cycle 19 to 24 or thereabouts, that number is somewhere in that below the 10% range on average, something around 5% on average. But after the implementation of the dual anonymous in cycle 26, that number jumps first to 15% and now somewhere around 30% on average. That was a huge collateral benefit and a great eye-opener to the idea that we could be reducing bias on a larger sense, not just for the gender disparity. So the idea behind a dual anonymous, of course, caught on like gangbusters. As soon as we were able to show that it was a successful program, we began to see it take off in other avenues. As I said before, we had some buy-in from the NASA SMD Astrophysics Directorate, and they immediately after our cycle 27 review decided that all astrophysics geo programs use this dual anonymous process, which this extends not just to the astrophysics general observing programs, but also extends to pretty much every single grant opportunity that they provide. So just a short list here. All of the astrophysics division now uses a dual anonymous review. All US astronomical public observatories use it. The European Southern observatories and facilities also have some form of dual anonymous review. And we've gotten several inquiries from particle physics senators like APS and SLAC, and from funding agencies, the NSF, the National Australian Government. All of these entities have asked in one way or another how we do it, how it's done, and in some ways have tried to implement some form of a dual anonymous review. We had a workshop earlier this year in which this was, again, another opportunity to share what works and what doesn't work amongst observatories. Here, it was led by the European Southern Observatory. And again, we saw that hands down throughout all these observatories, we saw successful policies with dual anonymous. But we also learned that there were things that we could do to further reduce bias in the community, some of which I'll go into in just a little bit. So how can we further reduce bias? Well, I think we understand what needs to be done. We need to think, we need to really double down on some of the activities that we've already begun. We need to improve on targeted mentoring programs for underrepresented communities. This can be done through partnerships. It can be done in many different places. But we really need to think about our selection criteria for engaging students, such that we want to attract students who have a propensity for doing scientific research, but not the experience or in many cases, not the exposure. Okay. One of the things that has definitely shown some progress, and sorry, I'll just forward one additional, are masters to PhD bridge programs, or any bridge programs that take advantage of or try to bridge the gap in preparedness from undergraduate institutions to PhD institutions. The APS bridge was a really good start. I certainly think this should try to be replicated in as many sites as possible to try and entice more students to go to the schools that they are most interested in going to, and which include in many cases minority serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities, but also helps to bridge the gap for that community to be prepared for the rigor of a PhD program. Going on 8 years ago, there was an inclusive astronomy conference in 2015, where I think as a community, we outlined what it is necessary to ensure that we have an environment which would entice people to stay in the field. And this includes developing family-friendly practices, developing and adopting inclusion policies and principles, and of course, adopting a zero tolerance policy toward harassment and bullying. These simple steps, if adopted and stuck to, could really help the retention within our community. The last thing I'll point to is that there are tools out there, I think, on the cusp of being fully implemented, which will help to determine the most appropriate reviewers for proposals in a way that allows to further reduce biases in their award rates. One in which I'm particularly proud of is this Pac-Man proposal thing, which really addressed an issue that we had in our own process, where when we had to go to recruit new reviewers, we really had very little insight on the community as a large. We knew of people who had proposed for our for Hubble in the past, and these Hubble insiders, and we tended to select from that pool over and over again over several years. What Pac-Man does, it allows us a way to expand that pool beyond just those people who are known to our system. And I won't go too much into this, but it basically allows a machine learning classification system through natural language classifiers to determine, what proposals, when you read the text of a proposal, what category, what science area it belongs in. And more directly, it can take proposals. I'll skip through this here. You could take proposals and match them directly to the expertise of a reviewer based on that reviewer's online bibliography. And this is just done through cosine similarity matching. I would encourage you to read the paper. For the sake of time, I want to make sure we have ample time for questions, but I would encourage you to read the paper and understand more about how this works and how simple Bayesian analysis codes and natural language processing codes can be used to your advantage to better sort and allocate proposals to the appropriate reviewers. It also includes a number of administrative tools, which I won't go too much into depth, but just want to say that we are using Pac-Man now in our STScI reviews, and we're looking forward to, as we did with the dual anonymous, duplicating it through NASA SMD and hopefully through the rest of the community. And I think that's where my slides end. I'd be happy to take some questions.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, thank you. It was really, really interesting. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so I think
We do have one hand up, George
Yeah, sure.
Stravinsky.
Yeah, I had a question about, you had mentioned that you don't take into account, in the reviews, the identities, but then at the end you look at the team and assess if they really have the expertise. And then it sounds like if you decide they don't have the expertise, you actually wholesale eliminate that proposal from the competition. And so how do you do that in an equitable way? And also, what do you say to the PI when that happens to their proposal?
Thank you, George. That's a great question. I can say in the 4 or 5 proposal rounds that we've done since the allocation of the time this dual anonymous and this tiered peer review, we have yet to eliminate a proposal based on the lack of expertise in the team. In fact, people have asked me if there was anything I would change about our process going forward. And the one thing I would suggest that we change is removing that team expertise evaluation. But we have learned both the people who have served on the panels have reflected to us, and I think we are learning very quickly that it takes a lot of expertise, demonstrable expertise to write a proposal. It's very hard to fool a panel of experts on your capabilities of doing so. So again, I think what we're learning is we've never eliminated a program based on the lack of expertise, and I don't think we ever will.
Thank you.
All right, so I moved to a different room just so I could help a little better. I just wanted to remind everyone that we allocated more time for questions because we wanted to have all the time we needed to discuss this topic that is really, let's say, could be a a big switch for our facility. I just want to remind everyone that we have Laurent. Denis is behind the plant. Connie is in the room as well, and Jonathan should be around as well. So if you have any question for Lou or for any of our senior leadership team, please go ahead. We have until 2:30, and we don't have to go until 2:30, but that's just to make sure we can cover the topic. So I saw Joe was the first hand up.
Hi, thanks for a great talk and inspiring. Could you describe about the Pac-Man part for your proposals? So I guess it sounds like you don't work with a fixed panel with a limited number of reviewers. Is it more of a larger pool of reviewers that you're working with there? Could you give an idea of the numbers involved?
Yeah, so yeah, I thank you. This is a really excellent question because, you know, this is an issue that we face that I think is kind of common with a lot of peer review panels, in that you have to recruit your panels long before you even receive your proposals, right?
Yeah.
So you have to determine your expertise, in a sense, well before you're able to do the refereeing. What this tool allows is a twofold thing. One is it allows a better analysis of who amongst your panel might be the best and most appropriate reviewer for the proposal. That can be both good and bad, because sometimes you'll have an individual that has a wide range of expertise, and that person gets every proposal, and then you can send everybody else home. No, that's not the idea. You really want to spread that wealth a bit. So you have to weigh this information with the availability, or if you will, of your panel. The second, of course, is that you can start to recruit at a wider range of people. For instance, now I can take a list of people who receive our newsletter, or any other list of professionals in our field, and start to do that assessment based on last year's proposals a little earlier to determine who best to recruit for this year's proposal. What it avoids is of course, the bias where I continually go to the same person or their collaborators for the review of a certain area, which I think is the key thing here. And it has indeed expanded our horizons. We start to reach astronomers who are familiar with star formation and galaxy formation, who may never have used HST, or are very familiar with the study of exoplanets, and never used our facilities in that way. So that's quite good.
Thank you. I realize also I did a very poor job at presenting people. So Laurent is our director, Denis, our deputy director, sorry. We have Connie, she's the assistant manager for the user office at APS. And Jonathan, if you can turn on your camera, is the XSD, so X-ray Science Division director. I think the next stand up was you, Laurent, or someone in the room.
Yeah. I'm sure there are other questions in the room, but I had an immediate question. When you do your agenda analysis, you keep mentioning this 5%, but do I understand correctly? It's 5% of out of 25. So in other words, is it a quarter? Is the difference a quarter, or is it 5% total?
It is 5% of total. I'll return to the slide. So this is the award rate. I hope you can see this. It is the proposal award rate. If you were to look at it on average, something like on average of gender, it is something like 15 to 20%, maybe as high as 30% per cycle. But the disparity that we're observing is the difference in, let's say, this 20% award rate in cycle 11 for male PIs and 15% for female PIs. That persists over a 17-year period.
It's quite impressive. And I was wondering if you had ways to cut the data in different ways, for example, looking at ethnicity or and because you focus on gender, but I was wondering how it translates into other metrics.
I am so glad you asked that question. I'll tell you why. The answer is no, because we never had access to that data. We have, based on NASA guidance, which comes from the federal government, we've not been encouraged to collect data, demographic data, beyond where the persons reside of our proposers. And the idea there being that should, without that information, it's sort of a bias-free environment. But it is a difference between, again, between the equity and equality of a proposing process that we're looking to address. And we cannot begin to investigate what other biases we have in our system without collecting that demographic data. So we understand that it's a double-edged sword, that it's not just the federal government that provides these guidelines. It's a community that's very uncertain what will be done with that information. So we have to earn the trust of our colleagues in our communities to explain why this demographic data is important to collect and get accurately, and to use it responsibly, so that that we don't end up in some uncertain future. But in the sense, we really need that demographic data to better assess where the biases lie and how we can correct for them.
Final question for me. I'm sure there are others in the room that want to speak. So Pacman, is that open source? Is it something we could use potentially at facilities like ours?
Yes, and so I put the slides together before we got our paper accepted. It was just reviewed and accepted and should be in publication. The source code is available. It's on GitHub through our. So I will. How do I do that? Maybe I'll hand it to Fanny or something, and maybe.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
We before moving on, we had a question in hands up from Catherine.
Yes, thanks. I'm at the user office at the Canadian Light Source, and you definitely have me convinced that this is something that we need to be doing. I have a couple of questions. One, how do you check for the anonymity of your proposals? Do you just fully rely on the proposers to do that properly, or do you check if they're trying to slip anything in there?
Oh, we do check. So with 1,000 proposals per call, it's a little hard to get through every proposal. We do have a diligent crew who do that, but we also have great community buy-in. They're pretty good at saying, this proposal violates the spirit behind our dual anonymous guidelines. And for less egregious cases, we'll insert that into the feedback to the proposers, and the panel is able to take that into account. Did they follow the rules? It's like, did they follow the page requirements, page length requirements? For really egregious cases, and we have had a few, especially early on, where folks just said, I'll just resubmit the proposal I submitted the year before. They won't know. We returned them and said, I'm sorry, this does not adhere to your dual anonymous guidelines.
Oh, that's great. And one other question I had, you talked a lot about the diversity of the proposers and their success rates. What effect do you see from the diversity of your reviewer pool itself?
Very good question. So we haven't done the similar analysis of our reviewer pool, largely because the tools to track our reviewer pool only came into line, I would say, in the last few years. In the past, it was managed by a spreadsheet, and it would take a lot more effort to go back and get that right. I will say that we have been extremely proactive about making sure that we have achieved both at least gender bias in our panels. It's one of the things that our panel, we have a science policy group who are assigned the task of recruiting and organizing their panels. And it's one of the key things that they look for is a good gender diversity on their panels. it's harder to get, as you may imagine, it's harder to get ethnic diversity on a panel. But they try to the best of their abilities, seek that diversity as best they can. But again, I think it's one of those things that if we were able to, or if we were permitted to, or if we felt that we were enabled to track demographics a little better, I think we would do a better job of it.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious, how many people do you need to check the anonymity of the proposal? Or the
So-
1,000 proposal?
Yeah, now that this is it's a twofold response. We have the science policy groups are responsible for their own panels, and each panel gets roughly, you can imagine there's 8 panels. They roughly get around 100 proposals to review, a little bit more than that, somewhere about 150. They are the ones who are tasked with reviewing the proposals in their panel, but it's also the job of the panel itself to sort of review those as well. We rely largely on our community to feedback, any information that would tell us that there's a problem. But now that ChatGPT is out there, there is some growing ideas of how we could utilize that to, train it to identify or to identify proposals that have been under and haven't done enough of anonymization, or better yet, to generate text that better adheres, gives our community better guidelines of what to look for, how to craft their proposals. And in all honesty, I should say though, I was rather pleasantly surprised to see that our community really got it, and they understood what we were looking for, and they responded very well. There were very, very few people who just didn't understand the concept of an anonymous review. They just had to sort of flip that switch. That, what do you mean my identity won't be taken into account when? And in fact, I think there's a good question here in the chat about how many complaints did we receive for those who felt their time slots were stolen by others. Surprisingly few, right? Well, I should say initially a lot. Before we even implemented, that was a chief concern, that responsibility of use of the facility is a big thing. But further, people have spent their careers developing their reputations, and you're taking that advantage away from them. While I understand the sentiment, I don't really share the idea. I think, and I know that people who've built their careers off of creating successful proposals have a tool, have a skill set, and they know how to write good proposals. We have found that people who have who in the past were quite successful remained very successful throughout the dual anonymous. There are very, very few switches, as one might think, of people who would regularly receive time and then suddenly didn't.
Thank you. I think Stefan had a question.
Yes, thank you. This was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. What surprised me in some sense most is the data that you showed, that what seemed to be like early career scientists or first-time proposers suddenly seem to have significantly more acceptance rate than before. I guess I wouldn't have thought about that, assuming that they would be perhaps less familiar with the instrumentation and therefore not quite as strong in writing the proposal. So I have 2 comments or questions in that part. One is whether you have any additional comments on this. I'd be really curious to hear that. And the other, as a thought, and I don't know how your program works, but what about people in situations like a postdoc or a student that might require just a bit more data in order to finish, and how the new system may respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good concerns that we had to address when we were crafting this. We thought that it's extremely rare where a investigator works alone on an investigation. They almost always work in collaboration with a team of a handful up to 1,000 people, right, depending on the nature of the investigation. The principal investigator is usually the one who's responsible for putting all that together into a proposal to be submitted. I think what we're seeing here in this growth of first-time users, or the growth of the award rates to first-time users, is that it's a bit of a changing of the guard, right? These postdocs and late graduate students are leading their proposals, taking the leadership of the investigation itself. They're not doing an investigation purely by themselves. They still have the support of their entire team. We also tend to pride ourselves on the amount of information that we provide to users, period, through our user documentation, through our instrument documentation, etc. I think it's a little extensive and easy to get lost the first time around, but I think it is still there, and I think it provides new users with a good safety net of how to go about doing their observations or setting up their how to set up their program. And I should point this out: our scientific justification is largely separate from the design of their observational program. There is some elements of technical justification to show that it can be done feasibly, but they don't have to design the entire observation set in that first round of submissions, at least to the HST portion of our program. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question.
Sorry for the long questions. The second part of the question was, in situations, and maybe this doesn't apply here as much, where you might have, PhD students or postdocs that need to acquire some more data to finish. If it's anonymized, it seems less easy to, as an institution, try to help in that space.
Yes, I think it's a little harder to say, we just need one more cycle to finish this person's thesis. That would be a straightforward sentence to write. Instead, they have to cite the successful work that they have built up into this point, and they may be referring to past awarded programs, and it may be a little bit more challenging to make sure that it's all-encompassing. It's not just the work that they're doing, but maybe the work done by their colleagues as well. But I agree with you. That is one area where I think that might be a challenge, but it doesn't seem to be quite yet.
Thank you.
Tony, sorry.
Yeah, Fanny. Hi, great talk. I had two different questions regarding the review criteria. After you went to this dual anonymous peer review, you mentioned that track record and experience kind of went after the fact of the scoring. Before that, was that a part of the scoring, which could result in the fact that a lot of the first time success rates would be lower because that was what the reviewers were looking at?
Yes, in fact, when we had our consultants come through, the very first thing that they noticed was that the in-person discussion focused on a bit more on the track record of the proposers and less so on what it was that they were proposing to do. And that did have an effect on the outcome. So in other words, if you looked at the individual grades by individual reviewers prior to the in-person discussion, those grades essentially changed significantly after the discussion, and that seemed to be completely weighed on the identity of the reviewers. That was an eye-opener for us.
The second question I had was back to Pac-Man. Everybody's interested in Pac-Man. I assume the way this works, and you can tell me if I missed it totally, is this goes out and collects a list of potential reviewers on various fields of expertise, and then you said there was a panel. Does somehow the panel or the head of the panel pick from that Pac-Man list, or how do you go from that Pac-Man list to the actual panel of reviewers?
So what I envisioned was that we could feed it something like a list of names from the American Astronomical Society membership. And it would go out and pull their bibliographies from the astrophysics data system, the ADS, and simultaneously determine their area of expertise in a way that aligns with the topical panels of our reviews, and gives a score relative to proposals that either we have already in our system, or upon run again, it can be matched to the proposals after we receive them. The initial idea was to give our science policy group a place to start, because more often than not, in order to avoid biases, we assign our science policy groups to areas in which they don't have direct expertise. And they're required to sort of look at what had happened to me when I first led it in the science policy group is like, go recruit people in exoplanets for this panel. I work in supernova cosmology. I don't know anybody in exoplanets except for perhaps my immediate neighbor. And that's exactly where we all start. You go to people you know, and you ask for them for recommendations, and it becomes this this word of mouth recommendation on who should serve. So I wanted something where you could upload a name and receive back a list, receive back an idea who would be most appropriate for this panel. And then after receiving proposals, think about the direct allocation of proposals within a panel based on their direct matches to those proposals. And that's exactly what it does. It just goes out to ADS. It thinks of those as texts. It works that text against our Bayesian classifier that was built off of all the other text proposals, and determines what categories they lie in, and then uses the cosine similarity scores after we receive the proposals to work in on direct proposal to person assignments.
But since just on this topic, since this is a natural language classifier, it goes through the entire text of this publication, not just the title.
That's right. It goes through the entire text. So we build word vectors through the natural language classifier, and those word vectors are used in against each other in cosine similarities to determine the best appropriate match.
Thank you. I think Connie had a question also.
I know one of the questions we ask proposers is, what publications can you provide that support your past efficacy as a researcher? How does your process handle that? Because I've heard people say people will do detective work looking at names in a series of publication citations and start making inferences about who the submitters might be.
So I think what I'm interpreting the question is, do I know that the reviewer has some expertise, period, that they have a good solid publication rate? And separately, can I determine their conflicts of interest independently from how they determine their conflicts of interest based on who they published with? Is that what you've asked?
I think Connie was asking about the proposer, not the reviewer, right?
Oh, the proposer.
The submitters.
Okay. My apologies. No, for the submitters, we don't actually look at their publications as such, right? What we found is that, yes, in the past, people would look at notoriety of a person or a team, or conversely, try to hold people accountable if they haven't produced publications from the large data set that they received 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Right. What those were the things that we were mostly concerned with. What we found is that, the first was absolutely true. There was a bias toward name recognition. The second tended to be less so. There wasn't really an accountability for people who hadn't published their data. So we tried to initially limit that information by moving it further and further back in the proposal information. And then we finally decided through this dual anonymous process to not really require it.
Thank you.
So I have a question that is maybe a little off topic, but when you described Pac-Man and how you use it to avoid like the word of mouth type of approach to find people, I was just wondering if this could be applied to finding candidate, for example, for postdoc. I know we often just contact people. Stefan is making fun of me. We often contact people that we know work in that field and say, hey, do you have someone, a good grad student, something? And this is typically something that will exclude some people that don't have that network. Do you see that as a possibility, maybe?
Yes, in fact, I failed to stick the landing of one of my slides, and that was, I think, what I have been most encouraging. What I've been trying to encourage people who I talk with about our process is that our process was sort of arrived at through a thorough introspection, a thorough review of possible biases in our system. I think others should do the same when they're thinking about applying things like this to, either their own peer reviews or for doing even hiring or for faculty jobs all the way through to technical positions. There are aspects of an anonymous or even a machine learned analysis process that can help, but you really want to think a lot about what is valuable to you. Do you really need to know the identities of your proposers at all times or your applicants at all times, or can you separate this process into a preliminary one where you're weighing largely on scientific merit, and a secondary one where you come back and actually look at the identities of folks? So yeah, to answer your question, I don't know that Pac-Man itself directly could be used to hire. It takes a lot of modifying to do that, I think, but the principles behind it could be.
Thank you. And Alec has a question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thank you again for a really fascinating talk. I guess just something I would say maybe we see anecdotally is that there are people, as you kind of mentioned, who are very good at writing proposals, but then perhaps not as strong at executing proposals, and vice versa. You kind of see, people who make do with a little. I guess, do you sort of anticipate any kind of feedback mechanism? Maybe you don't identify people, but you identify H indexes or something like that. Just some way to, not trying to build on their, I guess that gets to the reputation aspect, but some way of just making sure that the time ultimately is used productively.
Yeah, I'm going to try and understand. I think I understood your question to be: is there a way to track whether or not senior proposers are still faring well in our process, or if there's some bias that we're not attuned to that may limit senior proposers from doing?
I think the
not
question
even
was
necessarily senior, but just proposers in general, whether, again, not trying to discount new good ideas, but that making sure that the ideas that they do propose, result in something, at least at some, reasonable success rate.
Yeah, I would agree that I think we all agree that there has to be that proposals should make some accountants for how the data will be disseminated and results disseminated, and how and that it will be a successful program. I don't think that we allow for that space in the proposal process, and I believe it is the case that all successful proposals have done a very good job of describing how they will do their dissemination and how they will do their data, how they'll make the data available to the public. I am reasonably rest assured that we have not been fooled to believe that people will, game the system to gain time and then just do nothing with the data after they, get their time. We are a heavily prescribed facility, and it takes a lot of effort to win time over other very deserving proposals. And part of that is making a very thorough case that this is an exciting area of research, that it will very likely be used by, if not the proposer, by the community at large. And et cetera. I don't really see an issue with team expertise in our evaluations. I hope that answers the question. I apologize.
Yes, yeah, no, thank you.
Laurent, you have a question?
I was wondering if you have any early indication of the impact of the research since the new process has been launched, and how it compares to the, its impact is always difficult to quantify, but do you have any indication?
Not quite yet. As you're right, it's very difficult to quantify, and it significantly lags behind the award of time, right? For various reasons. One, of course, is that they just haven't had the time to do the full analysis on last year's data set. And in many cases, these are carry-on studies from over several years. We are, in fact, looking at we have our library is largely concerned with tracking success of the observatory. And I can say that we have an observatory H index, if that makes sense. It's just an H index of the observatory. It is perhaps the highest H index of all astronomical observatories out there. And it has not changed over the period of this dual anonymous process significantly. It hasn't decreased or increased. It stays roughly the same it stays on the same trajectory it has been over the last few years. That's our only metric yet, but we don't really have other ways of judging success other than the.
But I guess it's a time limited H index, right? Because H index can never go down.
That's right. Well, if it does, that's a problem, right?
So
but you're right.
It's a 5-year metric or something like that.
Yeah, so I think we could also just look at the number of publications. That hasn't really changed significantly. We could also look at the number of downloads that we get to massed data or archival data. And those continue to increase in a semi-exponential rate. All indications are that the observatory is as successful, if not continuing in its ever-growing success as it was before. I think one of the key indicators is that you might see a dip in the number of proposals you receive over time, right? Because it's not as scientifically relevant or whatever, and that certainly hasn't happened. It's still at the 1,000 proposals per cycle.
Maybe I have a follow-up on that question, because I guess the difference for the APS or the synchrotron community in general versus the Hubble and Webb communities, we may have a little less pressure on our proposal, like the ratio of accepted proposal versus submitted proposal. And so we do have sometimes user group that come unprepared, and the experiment is a disaster and nothing comes out of the experiment. I guess that's what Alex was referring to. And I just wonder in that case, so maybe that the second level of you discussed the fact that some after the rating, then you just look at the feasibility. So maybe in our case, that would be worth having like maybe a note from the Beamline Center saying, oh no, this group does not follow through, or they never publish, or something like that. Do you think that would be possible in our specific case?
I think
How would you approach that, basically?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and perhaps, I think what I would encourage for APS is that they evaluate that in some secondary round. What we did for the team expertise and background is we of course had our PIs craft a free form exposition of what their expertise is relevant to the program. What has become the norm over time is they list PI so-and-so has expertise in something or other, and they've published X number of papers relative to the not relative, but relevant to the proposal itself. That was not something that we required in the community. That just sort of been the way the community reports that. I could certainly imagine, filling in, relevant proposals or relevant papers, or both in that expertise section, so that it is available to whomever the allocating officer is, so that they can make the decisions from that. I really do. I've always thought that it was best to use your team of expertise your team of experts to do what they have expertise in, and that is doing a scientific merit decision. They have very little expertise in how to do the allocation. That's why you have a director, and they really can't say, what the efficacy of a team has been, because some teams write few papers, but they're of high impact. Others write lots and lots of papers that make very little impact. So there's a lot of variables there. But I think if that information was available to the deciding official, and you had the experts ranking of what they think is the most meritorious proposals, well beyond your allocation line, we do it down to twice the amount of observing time that's actually available to the observatory, just so that we can have backups should things go wrong. But that's largely in the deciding group's hands. It's outside. It's not in the community's hands.
It's outside of the scientific merit.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? So I encourage the staff and users, if they have concern about this possibly being where the APS want to go, like this is the time to discuss. You have your director listening, and that can answer.
No pressure.
So if there is no question, I will give back 5 minutes to everyone. This is the last call, so.
I should make one last plea, and that is that this would have gone nowhere if we didn't have the buy-in from our director initially. That really was important and key for them to understand the importance of reducing bias in the system. So it's my last plea to you all to convince them to have buy into this process early on. Otherwise, it'll be very hard to defend against senior members in the community as you go forward.
Thank you. Olga has her hand up.
Yes, hi. I just have a comment. So whenever we are gonna deploy the new way to evaluate our proposals at APS, is there any way either reviewers or panel chairs will be like involved in the development of the new approach? So yeah, because I'm at the panel at APS and at an SLS too, and SLS 2 started some ways in this direction, and sometimes it results in like extra 100 or 2 emails between the panel members and the panel chair, and then panel chair and then whoever he reports it to. So so yeah, because like all these changes happen like, oh, now it's gonna be like this, and we're like, how we apply all that. So so yeah, so keep in mind at least maybe like a panel chairs and ask them about how feasible, or you know, how to make this new change less stressful for the panel itself.
Maybe Laura, I'll let you comment on that, or Denny.
First of all, I think I'd like to say that, you know, there's nothing guaranteed at this point. We are very curious about implementing something similar, or at least doing a pilot. I think what has been presented today is, you know, to a large extent, very eye-opening. There's a lot of benefit of doing that, but I don't think we will ever deploy something like that without engaging all of the stakeholders, and certainly with a lot of respect for our chairs and our committees and our member of staff. I think it deserves more discussion. We're in a slightly different position in the sense that we are not observing the universe, right? Our users are also, they are creating their own universe because they're bringing their own sample to the facility. So there's a different level of scrutiny in terms of the preparation of the sample and things like that that has to happen at light sources. So I don't think it's something that's going to happen overnight, and it would certainly happen with a lot of conversation with all of the stakeholders and the sponsors as well. But it's, you know, the proof is in the pudding, right? The statistic that Lou has shared with us today, it's really impressive in terms of, in particular, the newcomers. Gender was also shocking, I would say, but the newcomers is even more striking, right? Almost a factor 3. So yeah, stay tuned. I don't think we're going to do that within a week or something like that.
And I want to add, maybe Connie, you can confirm that, or Becky, we are a little better equipped than Lou in terms of tracking progress, because we do collect demographic, right?
Yes.
So we can actually really have more data, even more data about the effect if we were to go that way. Any comments or last words? We're getting close to our 2.5 hour, 1.5 hours, sorry, my day's being long. Lou, I want to thank you again very much for coming. We've been waiting for that for a very long time. I think I emailed you like 6 months ago. So I'm really glad you didn't forget about us. We'll probably be in touch because we will have more questions for you, I'm sure. And thank you all for attending and sticking until the end. And nobody has any comments, we'll stop now.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.